Let's have a quick look here at the position limit setting. It's really quite simple. All you do is enter a min and max position that something can go to, and when you drag it around on the selected channel, it will lock at those points and go no further. And this control is available for all channels, both positional, rotational and scaling. There's a couple of uses for this. One is of course when you want to lock something off because pushing it in a range of motion beyond a certain value, a certain position, either doesn't make any sense for the appropriate control or will cause problems in a rig. Or alternatively when constraining something, as for here having the camera constrained to the light position, you see I can move the light around freely, but the camera will only follow it within a certain range of motion. That can be quite a common little trick that you want to pull off in rigging as well. Some constraints will cause this to be overridden. For instance, here I've used the point constraint to get the camera following the light, and as we can see, even with the limits on, the camera's motion is able to violate them. A trick that's less commonly used but might come in useful from time to time, if you had an item set up that in some instances you wanted to lock within a certain range, but in other instances you didn't want it to lock within that range, and let an animator control this behaviour. Of course, you can notice there's no kind of blending available for the limits control. You can cheat your way around it using a constraint of some other description, which effectively lets you create a blendable lock or limit for an item's motion. And this is generally true for all motion modifier type constraints. Of course, here using follower has exactly the same effect there as did the point constraint. And the same again here, where I have the camera's X position being controlled by the light's X position via a graph editor expression. Same thing happens once again. The lock off is violated. You can notice here I've used match goal orientation to link the rotation of the camera to the rotation of the light, and I've put a rotation limit on, but still that gets violated in this instance. And similarly using the go to goal behaviour and setting the X position to inverse kinematics, that also causes the behaviour to be violated. So there are a few instances where you'll find that the motion limits do not have any effect. You will find analogues for this. The motion limits is what's more generally called a clamp type of behaviour. So for instance here in the graph editor I can type clamp, put a bracket, I have the channel that's being followed there, the light position X, comma, -1, comma 1, close brackets, and that is clamping the result of the expression to within those values. So now that behaviour comes back again. Of course it's being driven by the clamp in the expression, not the position limits here. As we can notice, I can turn that off. And also if we look in places like nodal motion, we'll find that there's a clamp node which has of course similar behaviour and gives you a low and high lock off to be able to clamp values. A little mistake that's commonly made and obviously needs to be avoided is getting the right numbers in these two boxes. They are minimum and maximum. If somebody is trying to constrain something between say 0 and -1, it's very easy to make the mistake of typing in 0 and -1, which you'll notice defaults down to -1 on both sides, because of course -1 is lower than 0. So it would have to go -1, 0, not 0, -1. It's also of course not always the case that you'll use these motion limits actually in the mechanics of a rig itself. Sometimes it's handy to have on the controllers. You'll notice here that in my reverse foot setup, where I have the master controller for the reverse foot, I lock off the channels there to stop things going beyond where they need to be. You see, if I allow that to go further up to 2, then of course the foot starts to break as the whole system over rotates beyond what it should do. The other thing it doesn't prevent, and here I've just put a small animation on the null with it of course once again locked to go only to 1. You'll notice of course that in graph I have this just set to spline, so I get an overshoot of the 1 position there. The motion limits does not prevent that from happening, which is also important to keep note of. In a case such as that, you'd want to turn back to expressions again. So here we see I've just produced a clamp which clamps the value, which is the keyframed value of the channel's self, and put that between 0 and 1. And so when I apply that, we see the little dotted line that represents the expressional adjustment. And of course then in animation it does actually stop at that point. So there we go, motion limiting and motion clamping, the different ways it works, doesn't work, and the adjustments that you'll need to tune it exactly the way that you're after.